It was a quiet betrayal. Not loud, not messy, just quiet. I was clearing out old emails on a random Tuesday afternoon when I saw a forwarded message from the bank misrouted into our shared inbox, the one we'd stopped using after our second child was born. The subject read, Final Confirmation Unit 5C, Waterside Residences. It wasn't our house, it wasn't an investment we'd discussed, and it definitely wasn't something we bought together. I clicked. The attachment was a closing document, efficient professional cold. Buyer my husband. Funds withdrawn from Eleanor M. Harper Trust. That was my trust, my name, my money. He used my inheritance. The same inheritance my parents left me to ensure I'd never be financially dependent on anyone. The one thing I swore I'd keep untouched just in case. He spent $265,000 of it. Not on our kids, not on us. On a waterfront condo I'd never stepped foot in. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into his office or throw plates. I just stared at the PDF for what felt like an hour, the words blurring, but the dollar signs staying sharp. It felt like the air had been drained out of the room, but not in a dramatic way. More like slow suffocation, one breath at a time. Betrayal doesn't always come with lipstick on a collar or hotel receipts. Sometimes it comes in Helvetica font, carefully aligned margins, and your name printed under the word funds. I closed the laptop, walked to the closet, opened the fireproof safe we never talked about. Inside were the marriage certificate, the prenup he insisted was just for show, and a copy of my trust documents. I hadn't looked at them since the day I signed 10 years ago, but I remembered everything. I remembered the lawyer's warning, you don't need to share access unless you want to. I had wanted to. Back then. I placed the papers on the table, read every clause, every line, every footnote. Then I made dinner. I stirred the sauce while rehearsing questions in my head, not for confrontation, but for clarity. I didn't need to shout. I needed answers that didn't sound like excuses. He walked in, late loosened his tie, kissed the top of my head like nothing had shifted. He poured himself wine, told me about traffic, about how the real estate market was booming again. I smiled, nodded, asked about the kids' dentist appointment, our upcoming anniversary. I watched him lie with such ease, and I realized this wasn't the first time. Just the first time I had proof. After dinner, he said he needed to step outside to take a call. I let him, didn't follow, didn't ask, just wiped the counter slowly, methodically. I was done being surprised. What I needed now was precision. I returned to my laptop, opened a fresh document, started listing every account password and asset I could recall. Then I emailed my attorney, the one who handled my parents' estate, and asked to schedule a private meeting. That was it. No breakdown, no ultimatum, just movement. People always assume revenge starts with rage. But for women like me, women who've sacrificed careers, whose names have been quietly removed from decision-making conversations, it starts with documentation and silence. I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't cry either. I lay beside him in bed, listening to him breathe, wondering how long he'd been this careless. Or maybe he thought I wouldn't notice. Maybe he still believed I was the version of me who once let things go for the good of the family. He had no idea. I wasn't that woman anymore. I just hadn't told him yet. People like to ask were there signs. They expect you to say yes. They want a breadcrumb trail of warnings you ignored, red flags fluttering while you smiled like a fool. But my truth, no, there weren't signs. There was history. There was belief. There was love. When I met him, I was the rising star. I had just finished my MBA and landed a strategy role at a top consulting firm. I was sharp, relentless, and very aware of what I wanted. Not just in life, but in a partner. He was charming but grounded, soft-spoken, but when he did speak, it felt intentional. I liked that. I liked not being the one carrying every conversation. He wasn't flashy. He didn't come from money, but he respected ambition, or so I thought. He asked about my work like it mattered. He read the white papers I sent him, even the boring ones. We didn't fall in love fast. We built it piece by piece over shared calendars and weekend errands. That kind of love feels real, feels earned. He proposed 2 years in. Simple, no grand gestures. Just a question at our favorite bookstore where we always split coffee and argued about margins. I said yes because it didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt like a life. The compromises started small. I took a leave when our first child was born. Just 6 months then I'd be back. But then his startup had a shaky year, and we needed someone stable at home. Then my return to work offer was less than what I deserved. I told myself it was just a pause. 1 year became 2. Then came our second child. And suddenly I was the one who keeps the family running. I didn't mind, not really. I loved being a mother. I was good at it. And I told myself we're a team. My pause allowed his progress. One day we'd switch, I'd build again, he'd support. But we never switched. Instead, I started managing everything behind the scenes: school forms, medical appointments, tax documents, retirement accounts. And he became the face of our life. He made the speeches, shook the hands, thanked his support system, which apparently was me. There's a specific kind of invisibility that creeps into women's lives after marriage. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds, slowly, politely. And by the time you realize it, people are referring to you as just his wife. Still, I believed. I believed when he said he couldn't have built the company without me. I believed when he told people, Ellie's the reason this works. I believed because I needed to, because I had given up so much for this version of us, that to question it felt like setting fire to my own sacrifice. Then came the trust. My parents left me a sizable inheritance, not extravagant, but enough to give me autonomy. They taught me early, never build a life that depends on someone else holding the pen to your future. When I got married, I kept that fund separate as advised. We agreed it was mine, for emergencies, for security. I remember once, after a rough year financially, I offered to dip into it. He said no. That's your family's legacy, he told me. We'll figure it out another way. I remember thinking, God, I married the right man. That's the irony. He earned my trust by refusing to use the fund so that years later, when he quietly accessed it behind my back, I wouldn't see it coming. He didn't just spend the money. He spent the very faith I had in him. And the worst part, I had no one to blame but myself. Because I built the pedestal, I carved his name into it. I handed him the hammer and stood beside him while he used it. People think betrayal starts with cheating or stealing or lies. Mine started with a question I hadn't asked in years. What do I have that's still mine? The answer at that moment was painfully short. But that was about to change. After I found the document, I didn't confront him. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I made a choice, one that felt unfamiliar. At first, I would stop pretending. That meant watching, quietly, closely, without the filter of, maybe I'm overthinking this, or he's under pressure. No more self-editing. The next day, I told him I wanted to revisit our finances. Just a simple check-in, I said, like we used to do. He blinked twice, smiled too tightly, and said he'd pull some numbers together. But I already knew he wouldn't, because I'd seen the numbers, and I was done waiting for his version. That night, I logged into our joint account. Half the tabs were broken links, redirected passwords changed. The trust fund portal was completely inaccessible. I knew then this wasn't just a mistake. He was actively hiding things. So I made a new folder on my laptop. I labeled it plainly August. It was the month I started taking my name back. I began with printed bank statements, ones I'd quietly requested, through a friend at the credit union. She didn't ask why. She just handed them over in a sealed envelope and said, "You didn't get this from me." Inside were the last 18 months of withdrawals, wire transfers, and expense tags. Most were predictable, some were not. There were frequent transfers to an unfamiliar account, labeled Harper Ops LLC. I had never heard of it, never signed off on it, but my trust was one of the sources. He had named it after me, or rather, after what he'd stolen from me. The irony was suffocating. I found myself waking up earlier each morning, not because I was anxious, but because I needed time before anyone else spoke. That first hour of silence became sacred. I'd sip coffee in the dark kitchen, going line by line, through each record like I was solving a puzzle only I cared about. That's when I remembered the box. It was something my father had once given me, a fireproof lockbox meant to hold the essentials. Wills, contracts, paper trails. I hadn't opened it in years, but inside, tucked between old college certificates and birth records, was a single flash drive. I had forgotten all about it. When I plugged it in, it revealed a folder named Trust Fund, ORIG, and in that folder a scanned letter from my father, written a month before his death. If you're reading this, Ellie, you've already had to grow in ways I wish you didn't have to. This fund is yours. Not a gift, not an emergency fund, yours. Use it as power, not pity. And if anyone ever tries to convince you otherwise, walk away and take everything with you. I had read it once before, long ago, but this time it landed differently. That letter became my permission slip. Not for revenge, but for clarity, for movement. I started digging into Harper Ops LLC, registered to a P.O. box in a nearby city. Its filing address matched a WeWork location he'd once claimed to be just a networking space. My name wasn't anywhere on the papers, but my trust ID was. I needed confirmation. So I called an old colleague, Serena, someone I hadn't spoken to since I stepped back from work. She had a gift for sniffing out fraud. I told her just enough to get her curious. 2 days later, she sent a screenshot. Thought you'd want to see this. Your husband listed himself as the sole beneficiary of an asset-backed holding tied to that LLC. Looks like he used your trust to secure it. I didn't respond right away. I just stared at the image, then printed it and slid it into a file labeled Leverage. That night, he came home late again. I asked him how the strategy meeting went. He said it was fine. I smiled, then asked softly, "Do you remember that condo on the waterfront? The one we joked about 10 years ago?" He looked up confused. "What condo?" I shrugged. "Doesn't matter." He went back to scrolling his phone. I went back to planning my exit. The twist, of course, wasn't that he lied. The twist was that I had stopped believing him, and he hadn't noticed. There's something sharp about standing in front of a building you didn't know existed 2 weeks ago, knowing it was bought with your money for a woman whose name you haven't even heard. I didn't plan on going there, not at first, but one morning I woke up before dawn and drove across the city. I told myself I just wanted to see it. That was all, just see. Waterside residences looked exactly like the brochure. Clean lines, glass balconies, soft gold lighting by the elevators. Luxury without shouting. I stood across the street in a raincoat and sunglasses like some cliché in a low-budget affair movie. But I wasn't looking for drama. I was looking for proof, and I got it. She came out around 7:45 a.m., mid-20s blonde, wearing his company's branded fleece, carrying 2 coffees. She looked comfortable, not rushed. She didn't check her phone. She didn't look around like she was doing anything wrong. Because she wasn't. Not in her story, she didn't see me. But I saw everything I needed. I went back to my car and sat for a long time. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't crying, I was still. Like I had finally arrived at the end of a maze I'd been walking for months. I didn't call him, I didn't confront her. I drove straight to my lawyer's office. The receptionist looked surprised to see me. It had been years. I asked to speak to Laura, my estate attorney. When she came into the room, I handed her a folder. "I want to freeze the trust," I said calmly, "and I want to initiate separation, quietly, for now." She didn't ask why. She looked through the documents I'd compiled and said, "You've been preparing this for a while." I nodded. She replied, "Good." We spent the next 2 hours outlining every step, freezing assets, notifying banks, reversing authorizations, quietly removing his legal access. Then we moved to the next phase, securing housing temporary custody plans, a full audit. It wasn't anger driving me, it was strategy. That night I made dinner. Again. He came home late, again. He kissed the top of my head like it was habit, not affection. At dinner I asked him how his day went. He talked about meetings. He lied, of course, but I let him. Afterward, while he was in the shower, I logged into our shared drive, not the real one, the decoy one he assumed I still believed in. I deleted a folder labeled Ellie Documents. It contained old tax returns, scanned birth certificates, our wedding photos. I had copies elsewhere. I didn't need him thinking I was still living in nostalgia. Then I left something in return, a single PDF preliminary filing for legal separation. No note, no message, no demand, just facts, signed and dated. The next morning I packed a small bag, not to leave not yet, but to remind myself that I could, at any moment. He asked why I was up so early. I said I had errands. He didn't push, he never did. He'd gotten used to me being silent, assuming silence meant compliance. That was his biggest mistake, because silence isn't surrender, it's space. Space to plan, to reclaim, to rebuild. Later that week, I changed my email, then the locks on the safety deposit box. Then I filed a request for a financial audit of our trust distribution over the last 5 years. All without a word. Every day, I peeled back a little more of the life we had built and saw how little of it had actually been mine. And on the Friday, after I watched her walk out of my condo, I did the one thing he never saw coming. I took back control of the trust fully legally and without his signature. The email confirming the transfer came through at 3:12 p.m. Subject primary access restored. Eleanor M. Harper. No fireworks, no courtroom drama, just one line that ended a decade of imbalance. And in that moment, I wasn't his wife. I wasn't the woman who waited, supported, or stayed. I was the woman who knew and acted. You don't realize how many people benefit from your silence until you stop being quiet. The first to notice was his mother. She called after the audit freeze. "Hi, sweetheart, your husband says you've been a little sensitive lately. Is everything okay?" Her voice had that artificial concern, the kind that isn't really asking. I said I was fine. She sighed. "You know how much he works. He's under so much pressure." There it was, the subtle shift. I was no longer the wife who held the house together. I was becoming the problem, the one disrupting the image. Then came the friends. Not my friends, our friends. The couples we'd had over for barbecues, the ones who sent Christmas cards with smiling kids and hashtags like blessed life. They stopped inviting, stopped replying. Apparently, word had gotten out that I'd lawyered up, that I was being harsh. None of them asked why. No one wanted the mess behind the curtain. They preferred the version of me that stayed, pleasant, nodded politely, and played my role. Even the kids noticed. My oldest, Evan, who'd just turned 10, asked why's Dad sleeping on the couch. I said because sometimes grown-ups need space to think. He nodded, but his eyes said something else. Confusion, maybe disappointment. That hurt more than anything. Not because he blamed me, but because I had spent years teaching my kids about kindness, honesty, integrity. And now all he could see was division. I didn't fight it. I didn't try to force them onto my side. I just made sure dinner was still warm, homework was still checked, bedtime hugs still happened. But after they were asleep, I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, wondering, what does survival look like when no one claps for you? Because there's no applause for women who walk away from lives that look perfect on paper. You become the cautionary tale. The she went too far. The she should have just talked to him. No one tells the truth that she did. 1,000 times, and no one listened. Still, I kept moving. I met with my mentor again, Marianne, the woman who once told me, "You don't owe anyone your loyalty if they're using it as leverage." She offered me consulting work, not charity, not a pity role, real strategy work. I said yes. It had been 11 years since I had said yes to anything that was mine. Every morning, I dressed like I had somewhere to be. Because I did. Even if it was just my small rented office, above a florist shop with a single desk and a laptop I'd paid for in cash. It was mine, and it felt like breathing again. Some days I still felt hollow, like I was walking through a world I no longer belonged in, a world where everyone else got to pretend everything was fine. But I had stopped pretending, and I refused to go back. One night after the kids were asleep, he cornered me in the kitchen. Not angrily, softly. That manipulative softness that once worked on me. He said, "We don't have to do this, Ellie. We can fix it. Think about the kids." I looked at him and said nothing. Because I had thought about the kids. I thought about the example I was setting. About how my daughter would one day define self-respect. about how my son would understand accountability, and most of all, about how they would remember their mother, not as the woman who stayed for the image, but the one who left for the truth. Later that week, I stood in front of the mirror before a conference call. I was wearing my old black blazer, the one I'd kept in the back of the closet, like a relic of a different life. It still fit. And so did I. I wrote in my journal that night, he took the money. I took the mirror. And I finally saw myself again. Comebacks don't need applause. They need structure, documents, power applied with quiet precision. While he curated the narrative, she snapped, she misunderstood. It's complicated. I curated something stronger control. Through my newly formed company, EMH Holdings, I started acquiring partial ownership shares in a set of buildings, commercial residential hybrids, that were being offloaded by investors in distress. One of them, Waterside Tower. It wasn't just about the condo. It was about who controlled the rules. You see, Unit 5C wasn't owned outright by him. Like most luxury condos in that district, it was part of a long-term corporate lease structure, a clever tax shield tied to an umbrella entity. And ownership of the building didn't just mean bricks and elevators, it meant governance. I bought a majority share in the entity managing the building through EMH Holdings. With that, I gained voting rights over every policy rental compliance residency, approval guest limit security, and most importantly, violation enforcement. I never had to see their names, but I knew who lived there, and I knew exactly how to move. 2 weeks after acquisition, the new management board updated the lease policies to match city ordinances. All residents under corporate lease had to file verified financial documentation register any non-lease occupants and provide updated identity affidavits. They didn't comply. A notice of non-compliance went out 30 days to rectify. Failure to do so would result in lease forfeiture. It was standard, clean, bureaucratic, and completely enforceable. She was the one who panicked first. I know, because someone at the front desk, unaware of who I was, told me the girl in 5C keeps coming down asking if the new owner is a woman. Like she knows something. She didn't, but she guessed. He showed up one evening holding the violation letter like it was a death certificate. You did this, I enforced the policy. You're evicting her. No, the lease is. She just didn't qualify. He looked like he'd been hit. Not because I was cruel, because I was legal, because he had built his lies on loopholes. And I had bought the system around them. I bought that condo with my own hands, he said. No, I replied. You leased it with my trust. I just bought the right to revoke it. He didn't reply. He left, quietly, for once. A week later, the unit was vacated. I didn't step inside. I had no interest in reclaiming spaces soaked in dishonesty. Instead, I turned it into a rotating executive suite for short-term professionals. Neutral, clean, profitable. I didn't post about it, didn't update my status, didn't call anyone to say I won. Because this wasn't about winning. This was about undoing a theft so skillfully done it wore the mask of marriage. When the property documents came in stamped with the final transfer, my name wasn't even listed. Only my initials. Only the company I created. Only the power he never saw coming. And in that moment, I didn't feel vengeful. I felt accurate. Let him tell people I overreacted. Let her believe she was unlucky. Let the world spin their versions. I had the deeds. I had the compliance board. I had the final say. And all of it, every clause, every regulation, was built in silence. Success doesn't always look like a spotlight. Sometimes it looks like being asked to sit at the table you were once excluded from. 3 months after the lease violation letter went out, I received an email from a women in finance organization I'd long admired, one I used to volunteer with before the marriage consumed my time. They were holding a panel. Topic: Rebuilding After Setbacks Ownership. Autonomy and the Power of Starting Over. They wanted me to speak, not because I was a survivor, because I had built something quietly, efficiently, legally, successfully. I hesitated, not because I wasn't ready, but because part of me still carried the scars of invisibility. of being just the wife, of walking into rooms and not being seen for anything beyond the man I stood beside. But I said yes. That night after the kids were asleep, I sat on the balcony of my rental apartment, the one I chose furnished and paid for without a trace of his involvement, and rewrote my bio for the first time in a decade. Not supportive spouse, not home manager, not former consultant. Just Eleanor M. Harper founder, EMH Holdings, asset strategist, compliance advisor, advocate for financial autonomy, and I meant every word. The night of the panel, I wore a dark navy pantsuit, not flashy, just sharp, like armor tailored from restraint. The room was full of women in every stage of rebuild, recent divorcees, new founders, retirees returning to reinvention. I told my story, not all of it, just the parts that mattered. How I gave up too much in the name of partnership. How I stayed silent too long in the name of stability. How I reclaimed my future, not with rage, but with receipts. And when I was done, no one clapped immediately. They paused, held their breath. And then the room erupted, not in noise, but in knowing. I wasn't famous, but I was seen. Meanwhile, his version of the story began to unravel. The company he'd built on smoke and charm collapsed after an investor pulled out someone I suspect finally checked the books. Word got out about misuse of trust assets. Nothing criminal, perhaps, but certainly not admirable. The people who once praised his hustle now backed away slowly. The ones who mocked my overreaction suddenly had little to say. He reached out once more. Not to apologize, he never truly did, but to ask if we could reconsider the divorce, that we could reset. He used words like legacy, family, second chance. I didn't respond, but I did send him a copy of my panel talk, the transcript neatly printed with a sticky note that read, "Thank you for proving I could stand on my own." He didn't reply, and I didn't need him to, because for the first time in years, my life was mine again. I no longer moved through rooms as a shadow. I no longer whispered my worth into voids that refused to echo back. I was no longer the woman who lost everything. I was the woman who reclaimed what was never his to take. I didn't ask for recognition, but I got it in the email from a young woman who attended my talk. I was going to give up. Then I heard you speak. I've started again. Thank you. That was the only reply I needed. I didn't throw a party when the divorce finalized. There was no champagne, no trip to Paris, no dramatic haircut. There was just a Tuesday. I woke up, made coffee, packed the kids' lunches, and got them to school. I signed some documents for EMH Holdings, spoke to a client, responded to a nonprofit proposal. And in between those things, I realized there was no weight on my chest anymore. For the first time in years, nothing felt borrowed. Not my time, not my name, not my future. My apartment is modest. It's not the house we used to live in with crown molding and granite countertops, and a neighborhood that hosted wine tastings, but it's mine. The bookshelf holds only things I love. The kitchen plays whatever music I feel like dancing to. The bedroom is quiet, not empty, just peaceful. There's a photo on the entryway table, not of me and him, not of the kids even. It's a picture of my father standing next to the banker who helped him set up the trust fund. The caption he'd scribbled on the back said, "Build her something she can walk away from and still be whole." I didn't understand it when I first found it. Now I do. The kids are adjusting. There are questions sometimes, emotions that rise and fall like tides. But they see me now fully, not as a woman disappearing behind a dinner prep or calendar invites, but as someone who is here. We laugh more. We cook together. I've taught them how to change light bulbs and how to question what someone tells you when the answer doesn't feel right. I don't talk about their father unless they ask. When they do, I tell the truth, not the angry version, the honest one. That some people love what you give, not who you are. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away before you're erased completely. Once a month, I meet with a group of women who are rebuilding, some divorced, some widowed, some simply tired of being second in their own lives. We don't share war stories. We share what comes next, what furniture we finally replaced, what dinner we cooked just for ourselves. what boundary we held firm without apologizing for it. And sometimes we talk about joy. Not the wild manic joy that comes from revenge, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes when you realize your life is no longer up for negotiation. I'm not trying to be fearless. I still have doubts, still have days. I wonder what could have been different if I'd spoken up sooner, if I'd protected myself earlier, if I'd asked for more. But I no longer feel small in those thoughts. I feel centered, grounded, in motion. A friend asked me recently, "Do you ever miss him?" I thought for a long moment and said no. But sometimes I miss the version of me who believed I didn't have to protect myself. And then I smiled, because that version of me was gone. And the one who replaced her, she doesn't just survive, she leads.